Real change starts with people, it starts with us. At the AM to PM Wellbeing Service, we're building a platform for grassroots action. When you like, share, and subscribe, you amplify our mission and help us empower communities to build a better future. This is how change happens.
London is often romanticized in popular culture, a global city of red buses, black cabs, palaces, and glistening skyscrapers. Yet beneath the surface lies another reality, one rarely featured in tourist brochures. A hidden war fought in alleyways, council estates, nightclub backrooms, and prison wings. It's a war without formal declarations, without medals, and without front-page victory celebrations. Its casualties are counted in lost lives, shattered minds, and communities trapped in cycles of fear. This is London's drug and gang war, a decades-long conflict that in its own way mirrors the psychological battlefields of armed combat. The comparison to war is not a stretch. For those deeply embedded in this lifestyle, the streets can be as dangerous as any military deployment. Combat veterans often speak of hypervigilance, the constant scanning for threats, the inability to relax, the adrenaline spikes at sudden noises. Gang members know this all too well. In their world, a wrong look, a wrong postcode, or a casual encounter with a rival can escalate into life-or-death violence within seconds. Death doesn't announce itself politely. It appears in a flurry of blades, the crack of gunfire, or the silent suffocation of a backroom beating. Yet while war veterans in many countries return home to structured debriefing, psychological assessment, and at least in theory access to therapy, those returning from a gang conflict or prison stint in London often have no such net. Trauma is worn like an invisible jacket, stitched with fear, grief, paranoia, and moral injury. Many carry post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms for years without recognizing the condition, mislabeling it as just the way I am or staying on point. The absence of healing hardens them, and for some, the next violent act feels inevitable, a way to strike first before being struck down. The scope of this war is vast. Since the 1960s, London has seen its underworld evolve through eras and identities. The suited, hard-drinking East End gangsters of the Cray era, the multinational, organized crime networks importing narcotics through ports in the 1980s and 90s, the postcode-driven youth gangs of the 2000s, and the drill-influenced, hyper-connected street crews of today. With each generation, the tools have changed, from razors and koshes to semi-automatics and encrypted messaging apps, but the mental health toll remains constant, if not more severe. In the media, gang violence is often portrayed in simplistic binaries: victims and villains, police and criminals, good and bad. The reality is far murkier. Behind almost every young man or woman carrying a knife is a history of exposure to violence, neglect, exploitation, or coercion. Behind the hardened eyes of a high-level drug dealer is often a childhood scarred by instability or systemic neglect. Behind the bravado of a mid-level enforcer is the quiet dread of debts that can never be paid, and the knowledge that one mistake, one lost package, one intercepted call could mean a shallow grave. The mental health cost does not stop at those directly involved. Parents, siblings, children, and partners live with chronic anxiety, often fearing the next phone call will be the one confirming their worst nightmare. Innocent residents in affected communities adapt to constant threat, crossing the street when they see certain groups, avoiding certain shops, keeping children indoors. Over time, this produces a community-wide form of collective trauma, eroding trust and belonging. Even the so-called winners in this underworld war are not exempt. High-ranking figures who have successfully evaded prison and accumulated wealth often live in self-imposed isolation, plagued by paranoia, unable to trust even their inner circle. The lifestyle, glamorized in some corners of popular culture, extracts a relentless psychological tax. Yet unlike other public health crises, the mental health dimensions of gang and drug violence are rarely at the center of policy discussions. The focus is too often on law enforcement metrics, arrests, seizures, convictions, without sufficient investment in the psychological recovery of those trapped in the cycle. This omission allows trauma to fester, ensuring that violence begets violence generation after generation. This opinion piece will argue that London's gang war is not just a crime problem, but a profound mental health emergency with deep historical roots and systemic enablers. Over the coming episodes, we will trace its evolution from the suited East End firms of the 1960s to the hyper-connected youth networks of today. We will examine the unique forms of trauma produced by this lifestyle, from the guilt of taking a life to the helplessness of watching a friend bleed out, from the stress of prison rivalries to the nightmares that never fade. We will look at how these effects ripple outward, damaging families, communities, and even the frontline workers tasked with holding back the tide. We will also confront the failures, political, economic, and institutional, that have allowed this cycle to persist for over half a century. And finally, we will explore interventions that could help break the pattern, drawing on models from veteran care, trauma-informed practice, and community healing. If the last 60 years have shown us anything, it is that treating gang violence solely as a policing problem will never be enough. Until we address the mental wounds, as seriously as we address the physical ones, London's hidden war will continue to claim lives, not just on the streets but in the minds of those who survive them. To understand the mental health fallout of London's drug and gang wars, we first have to understand the terrain, the historical evolution of the gangs themselves. London's underworld has not been static, it has shifted shape over decades, adapting to new laws, technologies, markets, and cultural tides. From the tailored suits of the East End's infamous twins to the hooded silhouettes of today's county lines operators, each generation has carried its own codes, methods, and psychological burdens. And while the violence, greed, and ambition remain constants, the environment in which they operate and the mental scars it leaves has transformed profoundly. The post-war years in London were a breeding ground for organised crime. Economic deprivation, bomb-damaged housing estates, and a culture of working-class resilience created conditions where toughness was not only a survival trait but a social currency. Into this environment stepped figures like the Cray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, whose reign over the East End was part gangsterism, part theatre. They controlled clubs, protection rackets, and illicit gambling operations, cultivating both fear and celebrity. Rival outfits like the Richardson Gang in South London engaged in similar activities, often with extreme violence. Torture, intimidation, and calculated killings were tools of the trade, and loyalty was enforced through both fear and favour. While much of the violence in this era was contained within the criminal fraternity, the psychological environment was no less corrosive. Associates lived under the constant threat of reprisal. For those close to the centre, paranoia was a daily companion. For those on the periphery, the fear of becoming expendable was ever present. The culture was one of silence, the code, which made the processing of trauma virtually impossible. Violence was normalised, and emotional detachment was considered strength. As the 1970s progressed, the traditional gangster model began to collide with new criminal economies. Immigration brought new communities, and with them, new networks, into London's underworld. The drug trade began to expand beyond cannabis and amphetamines into heroin and cocaine, bringing with it an escalation in both profits and violence. West Indian yardis became a feared presence in certain areas, often linked to firearm offences at a time when guns were far less common in British crime. Irish paramilitary groups were also active, their influence in some sectors blurring the line between political violence and organised crime. This era marked the beginning of a more fragmented criminal landscape. Unlike the relatively centralised control of the Cray's heyday, the drug market was messy, competitive, and bloody. For those involved, this meant a constant jockeying for position, with allegiances shifting as quickly as supply routes. The introduction of firearms into disputes not only raised the lethality, but intensified the psychological stakes. Disputes could now be settled instantly, leaving little room for negotiation or cooling-off periods. The mental pressure to remain vigilant was immense. The crack cocaine epidemic of the late 1980s and 1990s reshaped London's gang dynamics entirely. Crack brought in fast money but also fast destruction. Turf wars became more vicious as small crews fought to control specific streets or estates. The postcode identity began to form. Young people tethered their loyalty and protection to geographic areas, and crossing boundaries could be fatal. The arrival of Eastern European organised crime groups with their own networks and ruthless enforcement methods added a further layer of complexity. At the same time, the prison system became a key arena in the gang wars. Leaders ran operations from behind bars, and prisons served as both recruitment grounds and battlegrounds. For inmates, the mental health impact was compounded. Incarceration removed physical freedom while offering no escape from gang rivalries, leaving individuals trapped in a pressure cooker of potential violence. By the early 2000s, the structure of London's gangs had shifted again. Instead of centralised crime families, loosely connected street gangs dominated. Many were youth-led, driven by a potent mix of economic need, local pride, and cultural identity. The rise of grime music gave some of these crews a public voice, while also, in some cases, amplifying rivalries. Drug supply networks diversified, heroin and crack still dominated inner-city markets, but cannabis skunk strains and later synthetic drugs played a growing role. Postcode wars became entrenched. Young men and sometimes women were born into rivalries they barely understood but could not escape. The murder of Dame Lola Taylor in 2000 and later high-profile killings of teenagers put gang violence firmly in the public spotlight. For the individuals inside this world, the constant threat of ambush on the street or on public transport intensified mental strain. Hypervigilance became second nature, further blurring the line between genuine threat perception and anxiety disorder. The past decade has seen gang activity evolve yet again, shaped by technology and market expansion. Social media and platforms like YouTube became battlegrounds where rivals traded threats and boasts, with drill music videos sometimes used as coded declarations of intent. These online wars could spill rapidly into real-world violence, amplifying tensions. Meanwhile, the county lines model emerged, in which London-based gangs exploited children and vulnerable adults to transport drugs to smaller towns and rural areas. This not only expanded markets but spread the mental health toll far beyond the capital. Young people groomed into county lines faced threats to their families, brutal punishments for mistakes, and an unrelenting sense of being trapped. The drug market itself has diversified further. Alongside heroin and crack, there's now a lucrative trade in MDMA, Xanax, and cannabis vapes. But the violence attached to territory and debt collection remains as brutal as ever. Today's London gang landscape is a complex web of small, shifting alliances, older organized crime syndicates, and international supply chains. Violence is more public, often captured on CCTV or phone cameras and sometimes live-streamed. Firearms are still relatively rare compared to US cities, but knife crime remains at epidemic levels. The average age of those caught in serious violence has dropped alarmingly in some areas, pulling children barely into their teens into cycles of trauma and retaliation. This evolution over 60 years has left a trail of unresolved mental wounds. Each generation inherits the psychological fallout of the last, whether through direct involvement or through growing up in communities saturated with fear. And while the methods, markets, and players have changed, one truth has remained. Surviving in London's underworld requires a psychological armor that eventually corrodes the person wearing it. In the next episode, we will step into the mental battlefield itself, examining how gang life creates PTSD and complex trauma on a scale that mirrors the experiences of military veterans, but without the recognition, resources, or structured paths to recovery.